Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer. Dani Katz is here. This is episode number 120 of Words, and we have a guest today. So we're going to do the guesty stuff right from the beginning. We're not going to talk our usual nonsense. Courtenay Turner is a podcaster and a prolific writer at Substack. She has spent a lot of time digging into areas that cross over nicely with things Dani and I have spoken about for years, particularly when it comes to things like the intellectual dark web, SFI, the outgrowths from that, like Lifeboat and Consilience Project and all of that kind of stuff, and then where all of this may be going. So, Courtenay Turner, welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. So we kind of like Dani and I are these like what we mostly I think specialize in is picking apart sort of people, the discrepancies in what people say and what they do. At least that's what we kind of do together, or sort of where someone's logic doesn't sort of match up with what their actions actually are, and that tripped us over very early the intellectual dark web. I think we started having like a very intense. We had a few minutes of appreciation followed by very early, very deep, and very dark critique of what they were talking about, what they were doing, how they were behaving, what the long game was. And then being in that sort of brought us to SFI sort of, accidentally at some point during the pandemic. We sort of tripped over some of that. So we started looking at SFI and the other things that it was connected to. And then, obviously we also all have been observing for much longer than either the dark web or SFI being in our consciousness, this obvious sort of move to like a more technologically based reality where we're fooled into believing, because that is my opinion, is that we are fooled into believing that technology is superior to us and that whether we like it or not, like that's the direction that the entirety of civilization is going to move into. And when you came along, and I haven't been aware of you for a while. I think I first heard of you from Dani, but when I finally went and looked at your work, I'm like, oh yeah, she's digging into all of the same stuff, but you're doing it with a level of patience and rigor that neither Dani or I have. So congrats to you on that. And
Thank you.
I would love for you to tell us how you kind of fell into this area of research, and then sort of lay out your case as to sort of what you think is going on.
Okay, yeah. So I came into this whole game B space very similarly through the intellectual dark web. I was very late to it, actually. I had been following a lot of what was going on with this independent movement. You know, the people who will say that there's a two-party duopoly, the two-party illusion, and not that I think they're wrong. There is a two-party duopoly. They always play Hegelian dialectics against each
Mhm.
other. My next book is actually on Hegel's dialectic. I call it Hegel's dialectic and Gnostic Jacob's ladder and a machinery of control. I definitely think there's an element of truth to that. But I was following this movement because they say a lot of things that resonate for a lot of people who are very frustrated with the uniparty. However, I noticed that they all seem to, or I shouldn't say all, but a lot of them come from this medical freedom space. A lot of them are huge fans of RFK Jr. A lot of them supported him for president. They seem to be in this libertarian kind of overlap, and which overlaps with the techno-libertarian. And so I was invited in 2024 to be part of this, I guess, kind of a think tank group that was combating the WHO, when they were trying to push through their pandemic treaty. And some of these people were there, and I was supposed to be at what they did later that year, or maybe it was in 2025, but they did their Rescue the Republic. And I did not end up going, which in hindsight, I'm actually kind of glad. But I watched it and I saw that Brett Weinstein was doing this speech. Now, I'll back up just a little bit. I had followed the intellectual dark web and I was, again, very late to the party. I always say, I was looking for the train station. It took me a very long time to find it. And then I found the high-speed rail and I'm still trying to catch up. So, uh, but in 2020, I became familiar with the intellectual dark web. And initially, I was very taken with it. I was very isolated. I didn't have much means of communication. They became kind of my proverbial background TV, when I would go on long walks and, I would drive an hour and a half to go for a hike so that I didn't have to be in danger of potentially being arrested for not having a face cloth on on me. And so I would listen to them because for those who aren't familiar with my story, I was born with a series of physical challenges and I actually learned how to speak by reading lips. So I'm bilaterally hearing impaired. I did not get hearing aids, so I was almost 6 years old. So I learned how to speak by reading lips. And I didn't realize how much I still depended on nonverbal communication until all the coping mechanisms I spent my entire life developing were then just stripped from me. And long story not so short, I was very isolated and I was listening to the intellectual dark web. I had not really listened to podcasts at all until somebody suggested I start one. And then they were like, you need to be on Rogan. I tell this joke all the time. And it's really not very funny because it's so pathetic. But, my response was, what's a Rogan? Why do I need to be on it? And so I started looking up who's Joe Rogan. I started listening. And that's how I found the intellectual dark web. And I was very taken with, Jordan Peterson. I listened to all of his podcasts, his lectures. I read his books. I mean, I had time on my hands now because I was fired from both my jobs. And, so yeah, I was very taken. But then I started to feel like there was some sort of a psyop going on. I realized so much of what this was about was this anti-woke movement.
Mhm.
They kept saying, like, when you would go and look them up, that these people were alt-right or far right. Now, the only one that you could even argue might be on the right is Ben Shapiro, and he's a neocon. He's not really like a conservative, right? And none of this is meant to be derogatory. It's just like objectively, I don't think of him as like right wing, really. He's neocon. So none of them were really ideologically like far right. It just didn't make sense to me. But that's what you found whenever you look these people up. But the one thing they had in common was they were anti-woke. And I was like, I hate the term woke. I feel like it was just created as a dialectical generator because now you get the anti-woke movement. And most of these people who were not at all conservative, but they just agreed that, a man's a man, a woman's a woman. These are biological facts. We don't need to argue about them. And suddenly they get slapped with like, they're Republicans or they're right wing. It's a way of shifting the Overton window and creating dialectical factions and warring factions, right? You've got woke, got anti-woke, and it does move the window because most of these people actually were not conservative at all.
Mhm.
And I saw a very similar movement happen with the medical freedom movement. You had a bunch of these people who traditionally either came from the left. I mean, a lot of the people who would never dream of injecting themselves or the child were either on the left or apolitical, and they were what I like to call the crunchy moms, the parents who would never dream of letting their children touch something that wasn't organic, would never bring harsh chemicals into their home. And again, this is not to be, this is just a fact. These are how a lot of these people conducted their lives. And most of them were very baffled when they said, because they rejected the injections and experimental drugs, that suddenly they were labeled conservative or Republican or, whatever the label might be. And a lot of them were baffled. They're like, I've never voted in my life, or, I'm apolitical, or I've been on the left my entire life. Like, this doesn't make sense. But it's a great way but a lot of them went along with it because they were so confused. And they said, okay, yeah, well, now that I'm on team R, and it shifts the Overton window again. So, but to fast forward, I saw this speech, the Rescue the Republic speech, which I do think was 2024. I'm losing track of time
Yeah.
now. Sorry.
2024. Yeah.
Yeah, 2024, but it was like towards the end. And so watched the speech, and the last 5 minutes of the speech, he starts talking about phoenixing the Republic.
Brett, our favorite, we've probably given more attention to just how embarrassing and easy to decode Brett is over the years, right? But yes, yes, Brett was the one who
Brett
said that.
Weinstein. So he's talking about how we have to phoenix, and it wasn't a throwaway line. It wasn't like, oh, we have to phoenix the Republic. Okay, let's get
No,
back.
we had Phoenix the Republic.
And he went on to explain himself for the next 5 minutes of this, like, only 15-minute speech. And he spent the first two-thirds of the speech talking about the West. Now, the title of the whole event is Rescue the Republic. Now, the West is mostly a democracy, right? The republic implies that we're talking about the United States, which is a constitutional republic. So why does he keep saying the West? We have to defend the West. And then he goes on to say we have to phoenix the republic. That sounds an awful lot like the Great Reset. Like we have to tear it down so we can rebirth it, kind of a thing. And yeah, so he goes on to give his, evolutionary biology lens upon why we need to phoenix the republic and his whole narrative about the past generations. And I won't go into all of it, but it was just baffling to me. And I said, something's going on here. I started looking into him more closely, which I really had never followed him all that closely because I didn't really resonate with most of what he said. I felt like he was kind of a hypocrite. I felt like he jumped on to garner the acquiescence and appreciation audience of a lot of the people on the right when he was never on the right, and he was just using kind of a political grift. And I don't subscribe to evolutionary biology, so his whole evolutionary biological lens didn't really resonate with me. All this just to say that I really, I wasn't very taken with him, so I just didn't pay that much attention. But now, okay, I need to pay attention because I felt like an op was going on, that there was some bigger op. And I was, I had thought that the intellectual dark web was, I've said this pretty explicitly. Of course, I can't prove it. I don't have a smoking gun on this, but I've really always felt that it was an intelligence operation. Now, of course, in the Manifest Nirvana, Andrew Cohen does say he doesn't use the term influence operation, but he pretty much says that it was like a breeding ground for Game B, which indicates to me that it was very much an intelligence operation. So again, people, I'm not saying that with certitude. I can't prove it. That is all of the data points seem to point in that direction. And I've always kind of felt that, but now I'm hearing Brett say this. And so long story not so short, I start investigating him. The first thing I noticed on his profile on Twitter is Game B. I'm like, what is this Game B stuff? And so I started doing research on Game B, and it sent me down quite the little rabbit trail. And of course, as I pointed out in my article, that when they said that it was a breeding ground for Game B, the intellectual dark web morphed into the intellectual deep web, which was David Fuller, who worked for the BBC, who did that documentary on Jordan Peterson, and it was all about Game B. So, yeah, so that's kind of how I found all of this, and then of course that led me down to, Jim Rudd and Jordan Hall and all of the other various players. But I saw that there was so much overlap between this libertarian space, this medical freedom space, this techno-libertarian space, and that, typically historically, when you look at, intelligence operations and influence operations, a lot of people focus on the very mainstream and the kind of obvious agitprop, but I think that historically they've been very invested in what might be considered more fringe movements,
Hmm.
because that is actually where you can start to move the needle. And it's where you can start to seed the narratives that might appear to be organic, which of
Hmm.
course they're not, but they have that feeling to people. And so I think that that's a lot of what is at play. And so that's really where I think where they're going is to, there's kind of two arms of it. And I know you're very familiar, but I'll just quickly kind of recap. But Game B started off as an offshoot of this emancipation political movement. It was the Emancipation Party, which was Jim Rutt's vision for a very Bernie Sanders kind of platform, and as he talks about it on his podcast. This is not covert information at all. In fact, he's even posted the links on his Twitter, so you can go find the way back, pages. But he says that pretty much like we couldn't get the millennials on board, and that was the huge problem, because he said that they were so like the idea of politics itself was such an anathema to them, and because it was such anarchist. And this is where you get this united independence movement that has captured a lot of these people. And so it becomes very relevant to what's unfolding right now. Because you've got the one arm, which was much more interested in what they call institutional reform. They were trying to create new political movements, which are centered around things like liquid democracy, which is an offshoot of the synergistic democracy, which really translates to AI voting. I mean, that's the most simplest way to describe it. But, I go through much more detail, obviously, in the article. And then you've got this other arm, which is all the more spiritual, the Daniel Schmachtenbergers, although Jordan Hall told me he had nothing to do with Game B, which I think is just verifiably false. I don't really think that that's accurate, but that is what he told me. And but you have the Daniel Schmachtenbergers and the integralist movement and the people, the cosmoerotic humanists, right? That David Temple, which wrote the first principles, first values of evolving perennialism, and it's the 42 propositions on cosmoerotic humanism. This is, of course, Mark Gaffney.
Danny's had the displeasure of interviewing Mark Gaffney, so we're very familiar with all of this.
Yeah. So, and he's reached out to me. He has not responded when I've responded to him, but he's given me his phone number. He wants me to have a chat with him and to correct me on where I'm wrong. But of course, these people are disciples of Barbara Marx Hubbard. So all this, not so short, but I will cap it with this, is that you see these two pillars, right, which do funnel into each other. You see the one side that is more of the spiritual eugenics, the kind of, more religious type of movement. And then the other side is the more institutional, but more of like rational, scientific, complexity science. However, when you look at technocracy, what is technocracy? It's again those two pillars. One side, they say on their definition, and I posted this repeatedly in my articles, that in the Technocrat magazine, 1937, they say the definition of technocracy is the science of social engineering. So what is all of this spiritual kind of quasi-religious movement? It is all social engineering. So you've got that arm, and then the other arm of technocracy is the new economic order, the international economic order, right? This is what the trilaterals were trying to do. This is what technocracy ostensibly was created to be a response to the Great Depression, where we were going to create abundance. What do you hear Elon Musk talking about? Abundance, universal higher income. Nobody has to work, and you can do all your creative things, and you'll just be artists. Everybody's going to become a world-renowned artist, apparently, in all their spare time. But so those are the two pillars. And that is exactly what you're seeing with this Game B movement, is those two pillars. So really what I think is going on is this is kind of it's being painted as a fringe movement that is tied to a lot of political and technological and military. Because let's not forget that Jordan Hall has a lot of military kind of relationships, and he downplays it all, but he talks about going over to Afghanistan and hanging out with General McChrystal, and he talks about his teams of teams, and I keep saying, what was he doing there? When he says, he hung out with the special ops, I'm like, was he having brewskis with them? Like, it doesn't really make sense, I mean, what are you doing if there's not something bigger going on, if there's not some maybe brainstorming happening and some operations perhaps. And then he was working with the Trust Foundation. Of course, Stanley McChrystal's on that, and so are tons of other military people. So yeah, I think that those are kind of some of the pillars. And I actually think there's a connection to Turning Point there, but I have not gotten to my deep dive on that.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We'll leave it
All
there.
right. Danny, do you want to take first crack at it, or you want me to take first crack at that?
Sorry.
And
So long.
there's so much there, so we can just kind of filter in popcorn style. I mean, the military piece. There's also Jamie Wheel, who he got put on our radar with his like naval stuff. We know that Eric Weinstein was with naval intelligence in like one of his earlier hidden iterations. And then you look at everyone who's on the board at Consilience Project, and I don't know if you saw that full page when you started your research, because I know that they've
Shifted.
They've certainly
scrubbed a
shifted.
lot. And then they went to like a subscription model, like you have to be a member to enter. Yeah.
Yeah, and luckily I took screenshots because Amazing Polly jumped on it. Yeah, so I have all the screenshots, but it's crazy how much is like military and defense are on the board of this narrative control organization. And I just wanted to mention, because you brought up Rogan early on, that like Rogan's how a lot of these people landed on our radar. So even though it might seem like a fringe thing. Like Rogan is anything but fringe, and he's why we have Peterson, Heather Heying and Brett Weinstein, and it's through them that we got Steve Kirsch and Malone. So recognizing that he's like a major entry point through which these fringe folks are funneling. And it also seems like, okay, so Jim Rutt wanted to do his political party, and then that didn't really work for him. It feels like Andrew Yang was one of their boys as well.
Yes.
Like they were trying to get it going with him. And then when that didn't work, then Brett came in with his duopoly and rescued the
Unity Party. The Unity Party was what he tried first.
Party.
Yeah.
Party.
Yeah.
Well, and Andrew Yang is involved with the United Independents, and he's very involved in Operation Phoenix. Operation Phoenix is their plan to put quote unquote independents in Congress in 2026 and for the midterm. But when you go down the list, these people are all arch technocrats. I mean, Andrew Yang is like a king technocrat,
Well, yeah, he's like that. He was the first person to bring major attention to universal basic income. So
Exactly.
Okay, so you brought up a lot of both of you brought up a lot of really good points, and where you talked about how like the sort of medical freedom and this sort of libertarian sort of overlap with the dark web, like that kind of happened later. We started paying attention to the intellectual dark web, and I just wanted to check in and see if you because I'm not sure sort of when you started, where your wake up story was, or when you started looking at things. But
2020, yeah.
Okay, 2020. All right. So I've been unpacking this stuff for 20 or 25 years, but in terms of intellectual dark web, like it first really came to our attention, with Jordan Peterson and his compelled speech argument. And then he was on Joe Rogan, and a few of the bigger players were on Joe Rogan, but where you really got to start to see all of the members, including the sort of less focused on members, begin to like unpack their baggage was on the Dave Rubin show, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where we very quickly figured out that there was something else going on and sort of shifted our opinion from, oh, it's not right, like, oh, like these people are saying things that is undoubtedly true. This is what they get you with, right? And there's other people who aren't technically part of the intellectual dark web, someone like Candace Owens or whatever, who falls into this. They say something that is undoubtedly true, but for some reason and you've known it's true forever, but it feels satisfying to hear someone who used to not agree with that perspective having moved there, and someone with a more I don't know if I would say quite mainstream audience, but not so like fringe conspiratorial audience or sort of community that you've been swimming in for so long. There's this it's weird satisfaction in hearing them say something that is obviously true, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's how they get you, because they say it, they make a big deal out of it, and then you start listening because you want that feeling of satisfaction. But then you start hearing all of this other stuff that, if you're listening with any kind of critical ear, is fucking nonsense, right? But for me, two things happened that
well, it's a trauma bond and it's a manipulation.
Yeah.
100%.
100%, right? So when the intellectual dark web showed up, right, like your point about how they would call them the alt-right or whatever, call them conservatives, I think part of what the intellectual dark web was actually formed in response to was the real alt-right, which the real alt-right was started coming about in 2012, 13, 14. And we're talking about Richard Spencer, Jared Taylor, Greg John, all these people who
Stefan Molyneux.
Stefan Molyneux, he was more, I'd say he was a more moderate member of the alt-right. I remember specifically because
I just have to tell you, with Molyneux, I predicted 2 weeks before he came back on Twitter. I was like, and I told a bunch of people who had no idea who Molyneux was, but I was like, Molyneux's going to come on Twitter. Watch, in the next few weeks. I was like, the timing's right. The windows are opening. I'm like, I can see it, and he did. Yeah.
I mean, the alt-right, I was tracking that from the very beginning, because I used to watch Red Ice Radio, which I don't know if you know what that is, but that was one of the best conspiracy podcasts back in the early, the mid 2000s into the 2010-11 period of time. Henrik Palmgren was excellent. And then all of a sudden, it seems like possibly when he got married to his wife, it had something to do with this, but he suddenly shifted from being interested in esoterics and conspiracies to being interested in white nationalism and, alt-right stuff. So he had a lot of those people on his podcast really early, like in 2013 period of time, right? 2012, 2013. And in the beginning, I was listening because I was curious as to why this was happening because it doesn't resonate for me. It's not my perspective, but it was
Right.
such a dramatic shift. And so I listened to interviews with all these people. And so I know what the real alt-right was. And I think the real alt-right terrified elements of the establishment who are really
Yeah.
dedicated centrists, right?
Yeah.
And so they wanted to create this illusion that the alt-right was like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro and people like that. And so those groups sort of overlapped with the intellectual dark web in terms of like the rise. And so what you're saying is they really wanted people to believe that Jordan Peterson was alt-right and become
Right.
satisfied with that so that they didn't find the other stuff and sort of join that movement because that's another issue to deal with. Now, that is also controlled and that is also part of the dialectic, but
Yeah.
they like a nice tight middle. They don't like to have to go so far out into the weeds on either side.
Well, I think they like what it's not so much that they don't want to go out to the weeds, they want to amplify the extremes because that's how you turn the dialectic and you get people who are like, "Oh, that is way too far out there for me."
But they,
So,
but they
yeah.
don't want people to understand the extremes. They want to
Mm,
pull the
right.
craziest ideas from the extreme, and then sort of amplify them with people who aren't the original originators of the message, right?
Mm,
Amplify them with people who are better at like communicating it to a centrist audience, which is where they want people to be,
right.
right? So the intellectual dark web in some respects was a response to that. But what really clued me in, and then obviously we were starting to experience all this crazy woke shit. So you're absolutely right that it was this anti-woke thing. But the giveaway for me, and this was like in 2017. I remember the day that I called Dani and said, "Have you noticed that there's nobody in the intellectual dark web who is anti-Israel or
Mm,
pro-Palestine?" It was
mm,
obvious all the way back in 2017,
mhm,
right? Which immediately started me looking past
mm,
just what they were saying and who the members were to who's funding this, whose idea was this, where
mhm.
did this come from? And I think that the focus was to create like this sort of energetic debate, like create this permission space for disagreement and arguing and like moving the conversation forward by fostering like having some differences opinion within the group, but not having any of those differences opinion fall outside of the margin of what the sort of accepted um, sort of technologically driven, sort of economically centrist, pro-Israel sort of dynamic was, and that's what that completely sort of to this day you can't find any member of the alternative dark web who has anything negative to say about Israel.
Joe Rogan. He has plenty negative to say about it. And
That
Joe
that's it.
Rogan, yeah, and Joe
That's it.
Rogan has hosted like almost all of Game B.
Correct.
And it's weird. So
Yeah.
it's like when I mentioned Game B, like to some people, when I was trying to bring this on the radar, it's like people need to pay attention. And the response I got was, Courtney, you're like so in the weeds, like nobody knows what you're talking about. I'm like, you know who the Weinstein brothers are, you know who Joe Rogan is, like, he's
The,
platform all these people.
the other thing about Game B, so to me, like
But wait, hold on if I may, because I want to speak to that. Because Emily and I have been talking about this stuff for a long time, and it's a
Yeah.
good point. How many people in this space, in these conversations, in deep research, have never heard of Santa Fe Institute, have
Yeah.
never heard of Jim
Game
Rutt,
B.
Game B, Jordan Hall, and don't understand what a big deal these players and these institutions really are to what's
Yeah.
happening?
Yeah. Even though they've been under their nose, it's not like they've been hidden, but
Mm-mm.
it's just that they've been packaged in such a way that they don't address what's actually going on. So people gloss over it. It's like I mean, I've listened to those episodes that Weinstein did where he talks about Game B with Rogan, but it's not packaged in a way where that becomes the focal point. It's like, oh, there's this other thing.
There's a COVID thing or whatever that's the
Yeah.
main part of the conversation, and so that part gets overlooked. The game
It's deliberately fragmented so that we can't put it all together, put all
Yeah.
the players together,
Well,
and put their various agendas together.
that's actually exactly what Jordan's response to me on Twitter was like, he was like, well, it's morphed into it's in phase 3. And I don't even know what that is. And it's all, he was basically trying to paint this picture that it's not a cohesive thing. And I responded, I think you might have seen my, it was like a full essay to him. And I'm like, you can say that. And I was like, but I can trace all these connections. They all go to the same place and you're still interacting with each other. But it's like any splinter group. That's what they do. I mean, it's like saying that, because Madame Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner had a little spat that they're not still both
right.
occultists, like
It's kind of, well, have you ever watched Westworld, right? Like, did you ever watch Westworld, the TV series?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
like, the whole thing is centered around this one particular created world, but at a certain point, you find out there's like 3 or 4 other things that are like the same thing, but different versions. Like, the people who, like, I think what sort of this, it's like a model or a template, and this game B idea has a number of different things competing to sort of win the game B level. Like they've obviously done a good job of explaining what game A is, and I think we agree. Like the
Yeah.
ruling
That's not a
factions of
problem.
the universe would prefer if everybody was just a sheep who bought the mainstream narrative and then they didn't have to put effort into creating, sub narratives and sub narratives and whatever it is, but that isn't the case. And so then you have this other layer that is game B. Like, how do we catch the people who game A doesn't work on? Right. How do
Mhm.
we get them sort of trapped into a paradigm to commit all of their energy to and to feel like they're really involved in something, but that essentially gets us basically to the same place, maybe a slightly different version than where we were going in game A, but basically gets us to the same place. And it's layered operation because like,
Right.
like they might have one group might sort of win. This is our ideal. This is what we want game B to be, but we're going to set up sort of like a backup and a second backup and a third backup just in case they get wise to this. Then we have another sort of narrative that's slightly different but mostly the same, even though it looks different, ready to go, right? So there's many people vying for the top role in game B. And then I think we should also consider the fact that if there's a game B, there's obviously a game C and probably a D and an E that we like that no one is talking about yet, but they have ready to go. And the person who's always, and someone who I know is never talked about as part of game B, but I feel like this person and the way she has like been, first of all, was rolled out and morphed and changed over the years is like a prime example of like how they set this up for like many possible layers of sort of dispersing it is Tulsi Gabbard, right? Because she came in as one thing and she's morphed and changed over the years. But
Tulsi Gabbard, is that
Tulsi
it?
Gabbard,
Yeah.
right? Like she's morphed and
She
changed.
stole my shirt. That's my thing with her.
Like your physical shirt when you were
Yeah,
sharing time
I mean,
space?
I was a CrossFit coach and I was supposed to lead like a workout on the beach, and she was going to be doing the workout. And it turned out that they had diagnosed, I had some sort of rash on my back, and I had gone to urgent care because it progressed and it was getting worse. And I was like having trouble lifting earlier that morning. And I was like, these numbers are weird. Something's going on. And so anyway, they diagnosed me with shingles, and I never made it to, so the owner of the gym ended up leading the workout, but he had asked me if I could give him my shirt for Tulsi to borrow, and I did, and he was like, "Oh, well, she wanted to keep it," and I was like, "She stole my shirt? What?" It was like my
Same.
coach shirt, like. So I'm always like, "She's a thief. She stole my shirt." I mean, it's really silly, but anyway, that's my Tulsi Gabbard
Well, there's
story.
lots of things that about Tulsi Gabbard that make me not surprised about stuff like that. But if you look at the core, like she's morphed and changed from like, a Democrat, right, to
Yeah.
this sort of independent, to a conservative, to right. And when you really look into her, she comes from a cult, not an occult, but probably occult, a cult
Mhm.
background. That it's weird how like all of the political positions that she now holds were also the tenets of the cult that she was part of that she denies having anything to do with, right?
Interesting. Okay.
Specifically how like the hatred of Muslims and all this kind of stuff, right? But if
Okay.
digging into the Tulsi Gabbard thing is fascinating, but like one goes, okay, like she's changed so much from when she first came on the scene. She used to be the Democratic sweetheart. Now she's like, the warmongering, almost neocon or whatever it is. But it's kind of like the system always wants to have a narrative and actors ready to go if their preferred story no longer works. So they're always cultivating something or someone in the background, right? And sometimes it's even like the same person who was going to play a role in the other one suddenly has this religious conversion, or they suddenly recognize the excesses of the left, and suddenly they've decided that they're a conservative at heart, or whatever it is. But like the main thing that they were there to drive home is still their center focus, right? It's just everything else has sort of changed around. The room has rearranged itself around that idea, but that idea is still the center of the room, right? And so like this is to me a way of setting a way for Peter Thiel, and one person who does not get Peter Thiel and his ilk, but one person who does not get included in this conversation, and I feel like should, is Larry Ellison, because Larry Ellison is the old school Peter Thiel, right?
Larry Ellison tried to buy out Palantir in 2016, and Peter Thiel said no.
Doesn't surprise me, right?
Yeah.
It's his wet dream. It's his fucking wet dream. But they're creating a competition amongst the people who are vying for a role as something slightly better than serfs in whatever version of the future they've been convinced is coming. Like they're creating this game, this competition.
Well, I think for 2028, there's going to be huge competition amongst the technocrats in the Republican Party, because I think that Peter Thiel is going to put up his protege, J.D. Vance, and I think Larry Ellison is going to put up his, which is Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio currently holds the same position that Kissinger held.
Yeah.
Security advisor and
Secretary of State. Yeah,
exactly. So
the competition amongst politicians for sure, but also amongst people who are creating these technologies or these narratives or these movements or whatever. Everybody, it's like kind of, this is a simplification, but it's like people are fighting for their ticket into the underground bunker when the apocalypse, right? Like everyone's competing for a role in building the monstrosity, so that they think that somehow they'll be exempt from the worst of the monstrosity, but they're competing against one another. It is not a cohesive movement. It's just all these different sections have essentially the same tenets at heart.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, I think the Weinstein brothers are like the quintessential examples of like wanting to get a better position. And especially when like Brett hopped onto your radar, Courtney, through the medical freedom movement. But when they pulled the FOVID op, like he showed up with his stupid mask and goggles. He and Heather were on Bill Maher saying vaccines are safe and effective. There was a narrative shift for them, or it was a long game and they were just acting it out. But they were pretty acquiescent, and they only hopped on pretty late.
Yeah.
And then
just
in
like
terms
Malone hopped on late too.
Well, and Malone was given to us through the Weinsteins. And I remember at the time, like, Emily and I were on top of that from the jump, and I helped make it right pandemic too. And so at that time it was like, well, why would Robert Malone be your medical freedom spokesperson, and Steve Kirsch, who's like a total lunatic? Like, these are the people you're giving to us to speak to this. And then it turned out that Kirsch was financing Malone and McCullough's like newer, safer mRNA vaccine that we keep, I think RFK kind of teased it out. But in terms of our ancillary players, and I so appreciate your research, Courtney, in just like pulling in a lot of the disparate pieces. I'm curious to know like how Eric fits in, because clearly he and Brett, Emily and I have a theory that they were trained on this track from the time that they were children. Yeah. But you also have Eric saying on his very first Portal podcast that he's funded by his friend George Soros. Mm-hmm. So, how does Soros fold into SFI and the larger techno-fascist agenda?
I just been playing in the background while we did this, Brett showing us how to wear masks and goggles so that we don't.
Because trust the science, because he's a scientist, and this is all very scientific.
Very scientific. Yes, it's a big show. Well, okay, I do think of it, and again, just my perspective. I will caveat that, but I do think of it as like an intelligence operation. Intelligence operation, things are very compartmentalized, but people have various read-in levels. So
Mhm.
that's where the term Q comes from, right? The highest clearance. And I think some people are more read-in than others. I personally, and this is, people can think I'm crazy. My crazy imagination's just working overtime. That's my alibi. But I do think that if we were to look at it in, a stratified kind of a classification, I think that Eric has a higher clearance than Brett.
Oh, for sure.
For sure.
Brett,
For sure.
yeah. Eric, interestingly, and it's really interesting because it's like Brett is always there to do like damage control and defend his brother. It's like, always trying to defend because Eric is not, as an out-facing, he's undeniably intelligent, but he's not very likable. That's just not his kind of. Whereas Brett is much more. I met Brett, and I will say he is,
He seems like a nice person.
yeah,
Yeah.
like he's got kind of like this sheepish, kind of meek, kind of dorky kind of personality, which is very endearing. He feels like he's probably just a nice kind of dorky guy. And I don't mean that like to be pejorative. I actually mean that it's very endearing. He seems like a genuinely nice guy. But all that to say, he's usually there to clean up and do some of the damage control. But Eric, I have never seen this. This is just interesting, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But on YouTube, when you go through the transcript, Eric's podcasts are the only one I've ever seen where you can do a word search inside the transcript. I have never seen that on. So he's got some sort of pull there. Like that's, I don't know. Like that's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, again, like people are going to be like, "Oh, what's the big deal?" I'm like, I've just never seen it anywhere else. To me,
That almost makes me think that the whole point of that podcast was a coding for people who are in the know to go in there and be able to pull out like keyword, right? Like to see like it's sometimes you can deliver a sentence that sounds like one thing to the public, but to people who are read in on something, they
Mhm.
know that that means something different. And so then they're referring to things that were said in that podcast, and the other people who are read in are going to go there and just search for that
Well,
thing.
it definitely
Yeah.
has to do with SEO and with
Yeah.
datification. I mean, all of that is a, yeah.
I just want to say, Courtney, for the audience as well, that transcripts are actually a huge deal. And a lot of the way that I get targeted is they'll remove access to transcripts or change access to transcripts. So it is a big deal, especially for us researchers.
Of course.
Like, yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it struck me because since I thought it was so convenient. I actually liked it as a researcher, I admit it was convenient and it helped me. But I've never seen it on any other. So I started kind of looking like, oh, maybe I just haven't noticed, but no other, on YouTube, I've never ever seen it except for Eric Weinstein. But again, that's just an observation. He does have the naval intelligence. I do get the impression that they were groomed from a very young age. Again, I
Yep.
do think Eric has a higher read-in level than Brett, and Eric's is trying to. It seems like his role is to create some sort of. I make the joke that they're on top of Plato's divided line, and they have all the noesis, and they're the experts, and so we will never achieve that level of noesis, and that's kind of his role. He's the physicist, scientist, and a lot of his his theory, his whole like theory of everything, which yeah is kind of any legitimate scientist doesn't seem to endorse it all that much. So,
Mm-mm.
but I think that is his role is to mystify people.
Yep.
So he mystifies them
Yep.
with the science. Trust me, I'm the expert. Of course, Brett does that to some extent with the evolutionary biology lens, but not the way that Eric does. And I think Eric has much more, kind of connections to some of these higher, operators. And he was the one who like gave that 18-minute video talking about the definition of the intellectual dark web and where that
Mhm.
came from. And when you listen to that video, undeniably all of the vernacular is game B. It is all game B.
Mhm.
So it indicates to me that he had some understanding of where this is going and what the purpose was and who the target audience was. Yeah, I do get the impression that they're
It is really interesting with the two of them, right? Like both of them have personal shortcomings that make them A, willing to do the role that they're doing, but B, also to be controlled by whoever it is that's above them, right?
Mhm,
And Brett wants to be liked and to be thought of as being as intelligent as his brother,
mhm,
and Eric thinks he's deserving of being a world famous, most highly sought after physicist that gives these talks on. He doesn't understand why he's not more famous in every way than he is, and right. So he's got this enormous ego, and Brett just wants to be liked by his brother's friends and be as smart as his brother. But there's always sewn into everything that they're doing. Like with Brett, there's always this thing where it's like, we agree with you that the people in charge aren't good, but the answer is not for us to question whether we should have this hierarchical thing where people are in charge and can tell other people what they have to do with their body and their money and their life and their whatever. It should just be that he and his friends should be in charge, right? Like that's kind of always the thing. Like, I'm going to be part of the team of people making the new decisions for what free speech will be, what medical freedom will be. This vaccine is bad, but it's possible there could be a good one in the future, and that good one you might need to be compelled to take it. Like this was the kind of shit that he used to say. And then Eric is basically like, you all are too stupid to understand how the world really works. So we need to come up with better lies to pacify you guys while we all go over here. And very important, we all need to afford to be paid a level where we can afford two homes, and we can just spend all of our time thinking about all of this cool stuff we're going to do while we sell you lies to, whatever it is. Like they don't, they're not good at hiding their motives.
mhm. Yeah, I think that sounds pretty on target. But I think when you look at his history with the Edge Foundation and the Final Questions, and some of these podcasts that he does where he's talking about, he does lay out really where they're going. I think in some ways the mystification is actually more effective under Brett because he gets so involved in a lot of the cultural kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Whereas Eric is pretty like he's more linear in his messaging. So it's but he's kind of spelled it out. That's what I was trying to point out in that Epstein transhumanist article. I mean, his question was really all about the whole like Skynet, and he said it on the Lex Friedman podcast.
Hmm.
Of course, he presented it as a concern, but I see this pattern over and over again. It's the very people who are trying to warn us about the danger of AI who are busy building the solution. And we have actually game bee people doing that right now. Annalise Smithman is definitely a game bee person. She uses the whole all the vernacular. That's always the giveaway. The lexicon. It's the Malachian.
Emergent, metanoia,
Yeah.
metacrisis.
Yeah. Well, she talks about the big word that she used that was a big giveaway for me was the Malachian
Mm.
world system, right? She always
Hmm.
talks about like this is the anti-Malachian world view and world system. And so what she's working on though is with Ben Goertzel and a bunch of other like club of her own people, the Michaela Ulero, who's like one of the ambassadors for Singularity.net. And they're working on something called the Participatory Framework for a Global AGI Constitution. And they're talking about how we have to parent AGI. I saw the movie Megan 2, and they talk about that. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is Game B. Like, when I saw it, it was I was so stunned that they're doing the operational preparation for the environment in this movie with this predictive programming. But yeah, they talk about essentially how we have to parent the AGI so that we can, create benevolent AGI. So they're warning you, they're scaring you that AGI is going to become sentient, it's going to go rogue, but we have to steward it. We have to parent it like we would a child and teach it the ethics that we want it to have. And then they go on in this constitution, in this framework that they propose, they talk about how not only do we have to parent it, but that then we might need to be subordinate to the AI because it will be better stewards of the planet. And so therefore it has better ethics than we do. So they're already laying the groundwork for humans, for us plebeians, to be subordinate to the AGI that they create. And this is an outgrowth of this whole movement. So, I mean, obviously, Annalise Smithman doesn't represent all of Game B, but this is coming out of this milieu. And it's tied to people like Ben Goertzel, who's doing AI for good with the World Economic Forum and the UN, and which is essentially social, Fabian socialist ethics, UN Alice Bailey ethics to steer us into their technocratic global governance. And he's also behind like Sophia, Handsome Robotics, and all of that. But yeah, so I think that's where they're going. And you hear a lot of this out of a lot of the other people who are in that milieu where they're warning you. I mean, that whole Cosmoerotic Humanist manifesto warns us about techno-feudalism. They say they're against transhumanism. But what I keep stressing to people is their anthro-ontology paves the way for transhumanism and technocracy. It is the only place it can go. And this is why, people don't like, they think, I can see people's eyes glaze over when I start talking philosophy and metaphysics, but it is the underpinning. There's a reason why Jim Rutt is doing a whole series redefining metaphysics. It's because he needs it to be hollowed out in order for them to create their complexity science, which is a cybernetic organism where we just become programmable nodes.
There's so many pieces. I'm sure, Emily, there's a bunch that you want to unpack as well. And I'm just going to put off to the side the Club of Rome conversation because I definitely want to explore that here. But I know, I'm not sure. It feels like maybe Emily and I have been tracking these players a lot longer.
Yeah.
So recognizing some of the tells in the podcast that they're on. So you can tell that the people are read in because anytime anyone from the IDW is interviewed, the podcast interview will make a point of telling the audience how intellectually superior whoever, if it's Brett, if it's, back in the day it was Sam Harris, if it's Tristan Harris, if it's like Eric, whatever, they're always setting up this hierarchy to let us know you're not as smart as these people are. And it feels like they're setting up like ultimately this intellectual elite group that, will stand in with the AI to tell us who gets to speak freely, who gets forced injections. I don't know if you ever saw the Tristan Harris, Brett Weinstein interview that they did on Dark Horse.
I don't think I did. No.
That one's a doozy.
It is such a doozy because Brett said so many of the quiet parts out loud that it was utterly shocking that we really can't have free speech for everyone, but the intellectual elites can have free speech and then they can meter it out for the rest of us who are too stupid to do that.
Distributed cognition, right? That's
exactly
what we're talking. Yeah, that's what distributed cognition is. Well, yeah, I agree with you. So what they do is they that's part of why they create their own jargon, right? Mm-hmm. So they're speaking their own language. They have all these words that you think you know what they mean, but they've created their own definition there. It's their own glossary for these words.
Yes.
And a lot of them are undeniably intelligent. I think somebody tried to get me to do a podcast a debate between some people, and they were telling me how smart they are, and I was like, I don't deny that they're intelligent. That's not my issue. My issue is, one, you can be smart and be wrong.
Yeah.
And two, I think they're operatives. I think this is an intelligence operation. So I also think they're trained dialecticians. So anything I feed them is going to be weaponized. They know how to steer the conversation. They know how to trap you. I call it the wizard circle, right? They know how to trap you in the particulars so that you can't discuss the universals. The universals do not require, superior, gifted genius IQ. We all were gifted with the ability to determine and adjudicate the universals. As long as we have a rational, sound mind, the most of us can do that. We don't need to be PhDs to do that. But they want to trap us in the particulars. And so you get trapped in the weeds. And what I noticed that a lot of these podcasts, what they do is that they have these, not only their own jargon, but it's these very long-winded explanations for things that honestly, most of the time I think to myself, wow, this could have been said in 3 to 5 words.
Yeah.
And it's not that complicated, but they make it sound so complicated that the audience response is
Yes.
immediately,
Yes.
these people are so much smarter than me. I mean,
Right.
I couldn't even think of, hold a sentence that long and hold a thought that's that complicated. And I'm not saying everybody listening thinks that. And I'm not, and this isn't to be patronizing. I'm not saying the audience is stupid. I'm saying they intentionally want the audience to think, oh my gosh, these people are so much smarter than me. And, they must have all the answers. And so they outsource their thinking. You defer to them. And again, they put themselves at the top of Plato's divided line. They are the experts who are talking down to you because
But
you were
this
just,
this is the
staring at the
technique
shadows
though.
on the cave.
Whenever somebody creates like 1,000 words about something that could be said in like
Five.
10 or 100 or whatever it is,
Yeah.
like that, like for most people, unless you've been, and in the United States at this point, people have not been raised to be confident with their intellectual ability, right? Like
Right.
that's something that went away sometime between like when I was in elementary school and what's happening now. And so for a lot of the people in between, that's gone as well. People assume if you lose track of what someone is talking about, it means you're stupid, not that that person has gone off into nonsense, which a lot of, like, I'm thinking very
Raffle gab.
specifically, right now I'm thinking very specifically of like the whole cosmoerotic thing and Mark Gaffney and all that kind of stuff. Basically what they're talking about, sure, they're against techno feudalism, but basically what they're saying is that's going to happen, but don't worry because you can just have sex and do all of this like weird like free love and drugs, and that's what that's essentially what it is. It's offering up a philosophy to accept your serfdom by being like, it's okay, I'm not going to have any economic liberty or any freedom of speech or whatever, but I can sleep with whoever I want and we can form all of these like bonds that are about nonsense and nothing and gobbledygook. And I mean, if you've watched the podcast where Gaffney is mediating between Aubrey and his two wives or
He's his
whatever,
guru.
right,
He's
right.
his spiritual guru. Yes.
But I mean, literally, they're sitting there discussing this relationship, like,
Expanded monogamy, which is the most sacred form of monogamy.
right, the most,
So
the part.
it's such gaslighting right there. This is
But that's
monogamy.
what that whole thing is. That whole thing is like ignore the fact that like this is not a sovereign situation, whether it be a world political situation or within a romantic relationship, and just focus on the fact that like you can have endless fucking.
Right. Ignore the fact that your wife is in hysterics, that your wife is having a full-on emotional meltdown
Right.
on the internet. Ignore that.
Yes. Well, I think, it's very obvious that they exploited her trauma and took advantage of her. But I think that there is an element of that, but it's not just that. I mean, that part is creating the religious component,
Right.
right? It's
That's
the
the key.
spiritual.
Yeah.
That's really what it is. So you're bought in to this religious kind of a movement, but they're still advancing transhumanism and technocracy. I mean, part of this whole polyamory movement and blurring the gender distinction is all about
Transhumanism. Yeah.
transhumanism. I
Well,
mean, that is the
it's also if you have UBI because you can't work because the robots and the AI took over everything, you have time to explore all of these ridiculous relationships and to do all of this kind of stuff, right?
good
But
luck navigating those.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I agree with you. I agree with you that that's
Yeah.
they go hand in hand, right? All of this abstract, like the more you have to abstract something that is like a standard normal part of life, like the more I become suspicious about what, like, the amount of arguing that's been done about what people will be called, right, for the
Yeah.
last 5 years, it has taken a lot of time away from paying attention to anything else that's going on.
Sure.
So whenever they're doing those abstractions, it's always that.
Yeah. I mean, it really is like the age-old, it's a Plato versus Aristotle. They're going to trap you in the particulars so you can't deal with the universals. I mean, if we all could have a shared understanding of reality, then we wouldn't be trapped in all of this nonsense. It is nonsense. It's bafflegab. I
Yeah.
mean, Jordan Peterson does the same thing. He takes like 6 paragraphs and cries in the middle to tell you something that sounds profound, but literally could be said in 3 words. But he does it all while presenting himself as like a false prophet, essentially. To me, he's a false prophet, but he does it in a very religious, it's like a sermon.
So
Sorry.
well, a couple things. Peterson, and there, I have like 3 thoughts here, but Peterson, I feel like kind of with Brett, I feel like Peterson believes his shtick. And I feel like Peterson, and Emily and I went to see him in person, like way
Yeah,
back
we
in
have too.
2017. Like we were into him.
Yeah.
But I honestly think, and I mean no disrespect, that he's not really that smart. He's taken his intellect to the outermost edges of where he could take it, but I don't think he quite gets what's going on. I think the ontological guardrails are really key, and I think that's one of Eric's main roles is to protect the questioning of ontology and to take it out of the hands of the masses and to say, no, like you're not smart enough to examine ontology. And I think that's why when they really pull Project Bluebeam, he'll be pushed to the front of the room on guarding that up. But I'm curious about the religious thing, because I know that Jim Rutt talks about this. I don't know if it's real or not, this split in the game be around spirituality.
Yeah.
And Emily and I have been watching Aubrey Marcus for a while, and I have a theory that they're setting him up to be some sort of messiah at some point. But then you have all this maybe performative, maybe entirely coincidental that everyone's a born again Christian who has to
Jordan
talk
Hall.
about. Exactly. So, what the fuck is that about?
Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the first hour of our more than 2 hour conversation with Courtenay Turner. All of her information is in the description box below. Please make sure to go check her out and note that her name is spelled Courtenay with an A between the N and the Y. Also, if you would like to check out the rest of this conversation, as well as our full archive of material, head on over to wordspodcast.locals.com and use the promo code Welcome to Words 26, all one word and capital, for a free month. We'll see you over there. Take care.